Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, in the ancient world, when a community suspected something was deeply wrong inside one of their own households, would you have spoken or stayed silent? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a place where something is already known but has not yet been said. It is not the silence of ignorance. It is not the silence of indifference or inattention. It is the silence of consensus, an agreement made without words, ratified without meeting, maintained without enforcement, among people who have decided, collectively, that what they understand to be true is better left without a name. Scholars who have worked with oral traditions from the ancient Near East and the Egyptian interior recognize this silence as a recurring feature of certain community accounts. They have documented it. They have found its traces in the gaps of papyrus records, in the unaccounted for periods between burial and inspection, in the soil disturbances that appear in necropolis excavation notes without explanation or attribution. This is the silence that surrounds the folk record known, in the tradition that carried it, as the account of the Sel'awa. This is the silence that a community maintained for longer than any one person's memory could hold, in a village so peripheral, so thoroughly forgotten by the administrative centers to the north and east, that even its name did not survive the centuries intact. What survived instead was the account of what was known, what was seen, what was inferred, and what was not reported not once over a period of years to anyone outside the boundaries of that small and ordinary settlement on the plateau edge. The record comes to modern scholarship through an indirect path, which is itself characteristic of how the most difficult fragments of ancient testimony tend to survive. It was not inscribed on monument walls. It was not entered into a temple administrative ledger, or recorded by any scribal office with formal affiliation to an administrative center. It was carried in segments through oral transmission across several generations before portions of it were committed to a medium more durable than human memory, a collection of Demotic papyrus fragments recovered from a secondary context, meaning they had been moved from their original location before burial in circumstances that the excavation record does not explain. The fragments were found together in the same deposit, wrapped in linen that had largely dissolved by the time of their recovery, and their physical condition indicated that they had been treated with some care before being placed in the context where they were ultimately found. Whoever committed the account to papyrus, and whoever wrapped and preserved those fragments, understood that what they were preserving was something that should not be lost. They took precautions. The precautions worked. Scholars studying the fragments noted immediately that the text did not conform to the genre conventions of formal narrative, of religious record, or of administrative documentation. It read, instead, as a kind of structured testimony in a community account, assembled from multiple voices but rendered into a single flat register. No emotion is attributed to any speaker. No judgment is rendered by the recorder. The text simply describes what was observed, what was inferred, and what was withheld in the ordered and matter-of-fact language of a people who had long since made peace with what they knew. The village itself is described in the fragments with careful geographical precision, even as it refuses to provide a name for itself. Scholars have worked to locate it based on topographical indicators embedded in the text. The account references a specific configuration of the surrounding land, a narrow floodplain giving way sharply to desert plateau, a dry wadi running northeast from the settlement, and a burial ground positioned at the plateau's edge, close enough to the village that it was visible from the rooftops of the taller structures during the dry season, when the air was clear and the light fell at the right angle in the late afternoon. No administrative center is referenced as having formal authority over the village. The nearest town with any scribal presence appears to have been at least half a day's travel on foot, a distance sufficient, in the practical geography of the period, to place the village outside the ordinary range of administrative observation. Whatever occurred within its boundaries occurred in a space that the larger apparatus of the Nile Valley's governance did not regularly observe, did not require to account for itself, and did not, as far as any surviving record indicates, ever investigate. The population, as reconstructed from contextual details within the fragments, was small, perhaps between 60 and 100 individuals at the time the events described were first occurring. The community was organized around a combination of agricultural and pastoral activity. The soil near the floodplain was cultivated in the inundation's aftermath, and goats were kept on the plateau margins where the scrub vegetation was sufficient to support them through the dry season. There is no reference in the fragments to any specialized craft production, to any formal religious institution, or to any figure of formalized authority within the settlement. The village was, by the standards of its period, entirely ordinary a settlement that produced what it consumed, traded minimally with whatever traders passed along the routes near enough to be accessible, buried its dead in the plateau ground according to the customs appropriate to its station, and maintained its own internal order through the social mechanisms of a community small enough that every person knew every other person and had known them for the whole of their lives. The household at the center of the account is described first in terms of its physical position within the village. It occupied a location that the text characterizes, in translation, as being near the road that ends a phrase understood by scholars as a reference to the track that connected the main settlement cluster to the plateau's edge and, by extension, to the burial ground. The household's position along this track placed it at a certain remove from the densest part of the village, a detail that the fragments return to more than once, as though the physical distance between this structure and its nearest neighbors were itself a form of explanation for what the account proceeds to describe. The household consisted of 3 people, a man, his wife, and her younger sister, who had come to live with them at some point prior to the events the account describes. The account is precise about this configuration. 3 individuals, a specific domestic unit, but imprecise, apparently deliberately, about everything that would make those individuals retrievable as persons. The man is not named in the text. His wife and her sister are also not named. This is unusual in folk accounts, which typically preserve personal names even when other details are lost to the distortions of oral transmission. The absence of names here appears not to be a failure of memory, but a choice. The community, in constructing and transmitting its account, decided to render these 3 individuals in purely relational terms: the man, the wife, the sister, as though naming them might imply a kind of personhood that the account, at some level, was not prepared to extend. As though to name them would be to claim more certainty about what they were than the community was willing to assert. The man is characterized across all versions of the account as someone who observed things carefully and spoke of them rarely. He is not described as suspicious by nature, and the fragments do not suggest that he was given to imaginative interpretation of ordinary events. He is described, in the language the account uses for such characterizations, as attentive a person whose attention operated continuously, registering details without necessarily doing anything with them immediately. His wife is described in the account's early sections in terms that are entirely conventional. She managed her household competently, was present at the community's collective tasks, spoke when spoken to, and moved through the village's social landscape without attracting particular attention or generating particular affection. The account does not suggest she was disliked. It suggests she was unremarkable. The sister arrived in the village at a point that the text does not specify precisely, noting only that she came when the flood had fallen, a seasonal marker placing her arrival in the early months of the growing season. She is described as younger than the wife by a clearly visible interval and as integrating into the household without incident. In the early sections of the account, she is described simply as present, a person who occupied space without demanding attention, who had come and who remained, and who gave those who observed her no particular reason to look at her twice. What the fragments say about her in later sections is of an entirely different nature. The first indication that something was wrong is recorded in the fragments with a specificity that scholars have found striking for its precision and its lack of alarm. It does not concern the wife or the sister directly. It concerns the burial ground. In the period following a death in the village, the account identifies the deceased only as one of the elder men of the lower field. The area of cultivation nears the floodplain. Those who visited the burial ground in the days after interment observed that the surface of the relevant mound had been disturbed. The disturbance was not the kind attributable to wind or animal activity or the ordinary settling of freshly packed earth. The soil above the burial mound had been moved and then replaced, and the replacement had been done with an arrangement that suggested deliberate action followed by an attempt at concealment. The attempt had not been entirely successful. Those who came to the burial ground at dawn on the second morning after interment found the surface imperfect, smoothed in the way that something is smoothed when a person is working quickly, in low light, by hand, and cannot verify the result of their smoothing until conditions allow for inspection, at which point correction is no longer possible. The surface was close. It was not correct. The community's response to this observation is the element of the account that scholars find most instructive, and it is the element that requires the most careful reading to understand in full. They did not investigate formally. No elder was convened. No watch was established at the burial ground for the nights that followed. The deceased was not re-inspected. What the community did, instead, was assess, and the assessment was conducted in the ordinary spaces of village life, in the intervals of work and rest, at the water's edge in the early morning, in the groups that formed naturally during the shared labor of the harvest preparation, in the brief exchanges between households at the end of the day. The assessment produced a conclusion. The conclusion produced silence. The fragments record this without apparent judgment. The community registered what it had observed, processed it through its internal social mechanisms, and arrived at a response that consisted, functionally, of doing nothing that would make the situation legible to anyone outside the village. This was not, the account implies, a decision made in fear of external judgment. It was a decision made in the particular register of a community that has looked at something difficult and decided, for reasons it does not articulate, that the difficulty belongs to them. The second instance of disturbance occurred some weeks later, following the burial of a child. The fragments mark the second instance differently from the first, not with greater alarm, but with a different syntactic register that translators have characterized as indicating increased certainty rather than increased distress. As though the community had been waiting not for confirmation that something was wrong, but for confirmation of the specific nature of a wrong it had already identified, the burial ground disturbance in this second case was more pronounced. The surface displacement was larger. The soil showed evidence of having been compacted and then redisturbed in a pattern consistent with a relatively contained area being partially excavated and then filled in with less precision than the filling of the original burial, as though whoever had made the disturbance had, on this occasion, been less careful about the restoration, or had been working more quickly, or had been less attentive to the evidence their activity would leave behind. The mound was visibly lower after the second night than it had been when the interment was completed. This was not a subtle difference. It was visible to anyone who approached the mound with attention and who could compare what they saw to what had been there the day before. The community did not report this to any external authority. The fragments record their response as again internal and collective. But in this second account, the text does something the first description did not do. It records what the community had concluded in the flat, unhurried language of the folk record in the same register, used to describe the planting of crops and the management of livestock. The account states that the community understood the disturbances to indicate that someone was entering the burial ground at night, opening the graves of the recently interred, and consuming material from within them. The word used in the Demotic text for this consumption is not the ordinary word for eating. It is a word that appears in other demotic contexts in association with ritual ingestion, with the taking of something into the body, as an act that is simultaneously alimentary and transformative, that does something to the consumer beyond simply nourishing them. The community did not apparently understand what was happening as a simple crime against the dead, the kind of violation that external authority could address. They understood it as something of a different order entirely, not chaos, not madness, not criminal opportunism, but appetite. A specific and regular appetite with a specific and regular object operating on a schedule that the burial grounds disturbances had already begun to make legible, and they said nothing about any of it to anyone who did not already know. The husband began to notice things about his household at a point that the account links temporally to the period of the burial ground disturbances, though the text does not state this connection explicitly. It trusts the reader to make it. The fragments describe, in careful sequence, a set of observations the man made about his wife and her sister over a period that appears to span several months, each observation recorded in the same flat and factual register as everything else the account contains. None of the observations is presented as dramatic. None is presented as conclusive. Each one is the kind of thing a person notices when they are paying attention and have developed, over time, a sufficient baseline of the ordinary against which departures from the ordinary can be registered. The first observation concerns sleep. The man noticed that his wife was difficult to rouse at dawn, not with the ordinary difficulty of fatigue, but with a consistency and a depth that he found, over repeated mornings, unusual. She had been, prior to this period, someone who woke without difficulty. This had changed. He noticed further that her sister exhibited the same pattern on the same mornings. Both women, on specific mornings, presented with the same unusually deep and prolonged state of sleep. He noticed this as a pattern. He said nothing. The second observation concerns the women's feet. This detail recurs in the account with a frequency that suggests it was considered particularly significant by the community's record keepers. The man noticed that the soles of his wife's feet were marked, on the relevant mornings, with traces of soil and fine stone dust, whose composition was consistent with travel on the plateau surface, the pale limestone aggregate terrain that lay between the village and the burial ground, a material and color distinct from the alluvial soil of the floodplain where the household's daily activity took place. He was familiar with this distinction. He had walked the plateau path to the burial ground himself, on the occasions that his work required it, and he knew the material underfoot. He recognized its traces on his wife's feet. He recognized them, subsequently, on her sister's feet. He recognized them on multiple occasions, on both women, on the same mornings that they were difficult to rouse at dawn. He said nothing. The third observation is the one that the fragments linger over with the most care, and it is the one that scholars have found most difficult to render in translation, because it depends on a quality of description that does not map cleanly onto categories that modern readers find intuitive. The man observed that his wife and her sister, on the mornings following certain nights, smelled different from how they smelled on other mornings. The text uses a word that has been translated variously as of the earth, of the deep ground, of what lies beneath, a word that appears in funerary contexts, in other demotic documents, in passages describing the atmospheric quality encountered when a burial chamber that has been sealed for some time is opened, the complex, mineral organic atmosphere of enclosed underground space, the smell of stone and compressed time, and the particular biological chemistry of the sealed dead. The man had some familiarity with this atmosphere from his work. He recognized the word that would describe it, had he been inclined to reach for a word, which the account records that he was not. He recognized the smell. He recognized it each time, on those specific mornings, on those specific women, and he said nothing for a period that the account characterizes simply and without elaboration as a long time. How long a long time was, in the account's reckoning, is a question the fragments do not resolve. What the account conveys, through the accumulation of these observed and unspoken details, is not the story of a man who did not understand what he was living alongside. It is the story of a man who understood, and who found that understanding offered him nothing, no relief, no clear action, no path through the situation that did not require him to hold what he knew in full and direct focus, which was the one thing he was not yet able to do. The village, during this same period, continued to register disturbances at the burial ground following each new interment. The pattern had become reliable enough that the community's account keepers recorded it without hedging, not suggesting that disturbance might have occurred, but simply noting that it had. The The community had arrived at a collective certainty that required no further qualification. They knew. The account communicates this knowing not through any moment of communal confession or explicit acknowledgement, but through the precision of its catalog, the number of instances documented, the intervals between them, the specific physical characteristics of each episode of displaced and imperfectly restored soil. A community catalogs things this precisely only when it has decided that the catalog is the appropriate response. When it has determined, in the absence of any action it is willing to take, that accurate knowing is the best it can do. There were individuals within the community who watched the household more closely during this period. The fragments record this obliquely, in references to observations made from across the road and from the roof of the grain store, spatial references that place watchers at specific points from which the household's entrance and the portion of the plateau path visible from those points would have been accessible to prolonged observation. What those watchers saw on specific nights is not recorded in the fragments. What is recorded is that the watching occurred, that it was sustained, that it was collective, in the sense that more than one person engaged in it without coordination or explicit agreement, and that it produced no report, no accusation, no formal community action of any kind. The community watched. The community knew what it was watching for. The community maintained its silence with the consistency of people who have made a decision about what a situation requires of them and who are committed to that decision, regardless of what their watching continues to confirm. The central section of the account shifts register in a way that early translators missed, because the shift is grammatical rather than lexical, a change in the construction of the text's sentences that moves the account from the register of recorded observation to the register of recorded inference. This is where the folk record describes what the community believed was actually occurring on the nights in question. It is not presented as speculation. It is presented with the same flat certainty as the physical observations that precede it, but it concerns things that no one, the account implies, directly witnessed in their entirety. What the account describes is an understanding assembled from partial and indirect evidence from what individuals saw in fragments as they watched from the grain store roof, from what the soil of the burial ground showed in the mornings, from what the man observed in his household, and from the interpretive framework that the tradition of the Sel'awa provided for making sense of what all of these fragments, taken together, appeared to indicate. The account describes the women leaving the household at night by means that the text characterizes as inconsistent with ordinary departure. The language used implies a form of movement that the record keepers considered anomalous not through the entrance in the usual way, not in the usual form. The Demotic text employs a construction that scholars have associated with transformation accounts in other Egyptian folk traditions. The records of individuals understood to move between one state of being and another as a function of what they were rather than what they chose. The community's account does not dwell on this characterization at any length. It states it and moves on, with the briskness of people reporting something they have accepted as a fact of the situation rather than its most sensational feature. What the women did upon reaching the burial ground is described in terms that are deliberately imprecise in their physical detail. The account records, the general nature of the activity, the involvement of the interment sites, the removal of material, the consumption of that material in the ritual ingestion register used earlier in the text. It does not describe the activity with specificity. Either the account keepers did not consider that specificity appropriate to the record, or they understood that specificity was not necessary for the account to communicate what it needed to communicate. The word they chose, need, in the translation that most scholars favor, carries its own weight without elaboration. Not hunger in the sense of deprivation, not compulsion in the sense of loss of agency. Need in the sense of a regular and recurring requirement that the body presents that has a specific object and that must be satisfied in the particular way that the body requires. The account grants the women this without additional comment. The transformation the account describes the shift between the women's daytime presentation and whatever they became on the nights they went to the burial ground appears only once in the fragments. In a passage that has received extensive scholarly attention, The description is brief and carefully imprecise. It does not provide the sensory inventory that would allow a reader to construct a precise visual image of what was described. What it provides instead is a small set of qualities: a change in the surface of the skin, characterized as taking on a property associated with dry stone, the texture and thermal passivity of limestone, rather than the warmth of living flesh; a change in the quality of movement, described as producing less sound than would be expected, less friction with the air and the ground than a person's movement usually produces, and a change in the eyes, rendered with a phrase that translators have offered as turned toward the inside, or looking at something that is not outside the body, or attending to something internal. The account does not explain what this last phrase means. It offers it as description and continues. The community had apparently developed enough of a working vocabulary for what they were observing that these three characteristics were considered sufficient to name the thing, sufficient to understand it as belonging to the category their tradition provided for it, and sufficient to make further description unnecessary. The Sel'awa, the graveyard-going woman, the one whose appetite takes her to the place of the dead. The community had a word for it. Having the word was enough. Having the word meant that what they were living with had a shape, and a shape, however terrible, is more manageable than formlessness. The husband reached the limit of his silence at a point that the account marks with uncharacteristic precision to 3 years and 1 full inundation cycle after the period in which he first began to notice the patterns the fragments have cataloged. The account does not explain what changed in him at that specific point. It records only that he went, on a specific night, to the burial ground. He went in the middle portion of the night, when the plateau was cold in the way that elevated desert ground is cold after dark, a cold that carries no moisture, only the mineral stillness of stone releasing the day's heat into the dry air, slowly, the temperature dropping degree by degree as the hours passed. He went by the plateau path that his household's position on the road that ends made familiar from years of ordinary use. He went knowing, as the account establishes through its record of his accumulated observations, what he expected to find. He did not bring a lamp. The account does not say why. It notes only that he went without light, which meant he navigated the plateau path and the burial ground by whatever the sky-provided stars in the account's description, which were numerous and clear on the night he chose, giving a faint general luminosity to the pale limestone surface of the plateau without providing warmth or direction. He found evidence of activity at a grave that had received an interment earlier in the week. He found the soil displaced in the pattern the account has described throughout the characteristic imprecision of hasty reclosure, the slightly irregular surface, the depression at the crown. He found traces. The account does not specify the nature of the traces. It uses a construction that implies material remnants associated with the activity he had inferred over the preceding years without describing those remnants. And it records that he stood at the burial ground for a period the text characterizes as until the stars had moved by a measurable interval, a phrase that translators understand as indicating extended and motionless presence. Not a brief survey, but a sustained occupation of the space, standing still on the pale limestone ground among the irregular mounds, in the cold, in the dark, for longer than most people stand still in a single place. He returned to the household before dawn. He said nothing when the women woke, late, with soil on their feet and the mineral smell of the deep ground on their skin. The account records his return and his silence as though they were equivalent and unremarkable facts, as though what he did upon returning was not a choice made under unbearable pressure, but simply another in the long series of observations and non-responses that the fragments have been cataloging all along. He went, he found what was there, he stood in it for a long time, he returned, he said nothing. This is what the account records. It offers no other frame. The community's awareness, in the final period of the events the account describes, had achieved a quality that the fragments characterize with particular care. It was not the awareness of people who were still in the process of coming to understand something. It was the awareness of people who had understood for a long time and had integrated that understanding into the fabric of their daily life in the way that a community integrates any persistent and unresolvable difficulty by developing practices around it, by accommodating it into the structure of what is ordinary, by finding the specific forms of management that allow life to continue in its presence. The modifications to the burial practices that the community had developed are described in this section of the account. They involved additional preparation of the interment, additional binding of the burial materials, the placement of specific weights above the mound in the days immediately following burial, the application of a particular preparation to the mound surface that the account describes in terms suggesting a compound of mineral materials that would, if disturbed, leave visible evidence of the disturbance that would be difficult to conceal. These modifications were not explained to outsiders. They were not described in terms that would make their purpose legible to any observer unfamiliar with the situation they were designed to address. They were the community's practical adaptation to a specific and persistent problem interventions whose logic was entirely transparent to the people applying them and entirely opaque to anyone else. They were partially effective. The account records this with the precision of careful observers. The modifications slowed the disturbances, reduced their extent on the nights they occurred, but did not stop them. The burial ground continued to show evidence of activity. The evidence, after the modifications were implemented, was less pronounced. The community noted the difference, adjusted their preparations accordingly, and continued. The wife and her sister, during this final period, continued to function normally within the village's daily life. This detail is the one that modern readers, approaching the account for the first time, find most difficult to process, not because it strains the internal logic of the account, which has prepared its reader carefully for exactly this, but because of what it asks the reader to hold simultaneously: the women present at the water in the morning, the women visible from the grain store roof, the women at the edge of the communal harvest work, the women exchanging words with their neighbors in the flat language of ordinary daily transaction, and, on the same days, the burial ground with its modified mounds, the traces, the smell in the household at dawn, the pale limestone dust on the soles of their feet. The community held both of these things. They held them at the same time, in the same cognitive space, for years. They spoke to the women, they saw them every day, they knew what the women were and what the women did on the nights the mounds were disturbed, and they looked at them at the water's edge in the morning and said the ordinary things that people say to one another in the mornings, and they received in return the ordinary responses, and none of this was, apparently, experienced by the community as a contradiction that required resolution. It was experienced as the specific form of coexistence that occurs when people who share a space with something they cannot remove, cannot report, and cannot openly name decide to simply share the space on the terms that the space imposes, for as long as the sharing is required of them. What the account preserves about the texture of daily life in the village during the years the events describe is, in some respects, its most unsettling contribution to the scholarly record, not because of any single detail, but because of the aggregate picture those details compose. The community continued to do everything that communities do. The inundation came and receded, and the fields were planted. The goats were moved to the plateau margins when the scrub allowed, and brought back to the lower ground when the season turned. The dead were buried with the rites appropriate to their station, modified now by the additional preparations the community had developed, but buried nonetheless in the ground they had always used. On the plateau edge, within sight of the household, at the end of the road, children were born, elders died. The cycle of the agricultural year imposed its rhythm on the settlement as it always had, indifferent to what the settlement knew and what the settlement was managing in the space between its ordinary activity and the disclosure it had decided never to make. The fragments record several small details from this period that the account's compilers appear to have included not because they were dramatic, but because they were representative, because they conveyed, through their very ordinariness, the quality of the coexistence the community had achieved. The wife was present at the birth of a neighbor's child. The sister helped carry water during the preparation of a communal meal, following a funeral, the funeral of a man whose grave, the account notes without further comment, was modified in the way all graves were now modified, and whose burial mound showed no disturbance in the days that followed. These details are placed in the account without apparent irony. They are simply there, in the sequence, occupying the same narrative space as the observations about disturbed soil and mineral smell and the stars moving overhead while the husband stood motionless among the opened graves. The account does not comment on the juxtaposition. It does not need to. The juxtaposition is the account's central argument, stated not in the language of argument, but in the language of sequence. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and all of it happened in the same place, among the same people, and the people continued. There is a passage near the midpoint of the account that scholars have returned to repeatedly, not because it contains new information about the events described, but because of what it reveals about the community's relationship to the knowledge it was carrying. It is a passage that concerns the husband, specifically the only passage in the account that grants him anything approaching an interior life, and even here the interiority is rendered in the account's characteristic oblique style through external observation rather than direct attribution of thought or feeling. The passage records that the man, during the period the account is describing, developed a habit of sitting at the entrance of the household in the evenings after the day's work was done, facing in the direction of the plateau. The account notes that he sat there without speaking, on many evenings, for intervals that the account characterizes as longer than sitting without purpose. He was not resting. He was not waiting for a visitor. The household's entrance faced northeast, toward the plateau path, and the plateau path led, in the direction he faced, toward the burial ground. The account records this habit without attributing to it any explicit significance. It simply notes that the habit existed, that it was observed by others, that it continued for a long time, and that no one who observed it, not the community members who saw him sitting there, not the wife or her sister who passed him on their way in and out of the household, said anything about it. He sat facing the plateau. They walked past him. He said nothing. They said nothing. The account does not tell the reader what the man was doing in those evenings, what he was working through, what he was watching for, or what he had decided. It tells the reader only that he faced in that direction for that long without speaking, and that this was something that people noticed and that nobody addressed. In a document that has made the unspoken its central subject, this passage functions as a kind of summary, not of events, but of the condition the events had produced. A man sitting in the evening, facing the direction of what he knew, in the company of what he knew, with the community's awareness of all of it available to anyone who cared to think about what the sitting meant. The silence in that image is not empty. It has the specific weight of everything the account has been describing, full, precise, maintained, and shared by everyone present without any of them having said a word. The account's relationship to time deserves particular attention because it is one of the features that most clearly distinguishes this record from other documents in the Sel'awa tradition. Most folk accounts of this type are organized around a single accelerating arc: the emergence, the discovery, the confrontation, the resolution, or the flight. They follow the shape of a crisis. This account does not follow that shape. It is organized, instead, around duration, around the experience of something not as a crisis that arrives and resolves, but as a condition that persists, that becomes familiar, that the community learns to live inside of with increasing competence. The account documents not a crisis, but an accommodation, and in doing so it asks its reader to consider a question that the crisis narrative structure of most folk accounts allows the reader to avoid. What does it mean to know something this specific, this serious, and this continuous, for years, in close daily proximity to the people the knowledge concerns? What does that knowing do to the texture of ordinary life, not in a single dramatic moment, but across seasons and harvests and deaths and births and all the incremental change that constitutes the actual lived experience of time in a small settlement on a plateau edge. The account answers this question not abstractly, but concretely, through the accumulation of its detail: the mornings, the feet, the smell, the mounds, the sitting in the evening, the modified preparations, the continued participation in communal meals and births, and ordinary exchanges of morning words. It answers it by showing that the texture of ordinary life, under these conditions, remains recognizable, that the ordinary continues, that people find a way to keep doing what people do, even while carrying what this community carried, because the alternative to be broken by the carrying is not something that small communities with 60 to 100 people and no access to any external authority capable of addressing their situation can afford. They carry it, they manage it, they build their management into the structure of their practice quietly without explanation, and they continue. The account is a record of that continuation. It is, in the deepest sense, a document about the resilience of ordinary life in the face of something that ordinary life was not designed to accommodate, and about the cost of that resilience, which is the silence, sustained across years, that the fragments preserve. The account does not end with confrontation. It does not record a moment of exposure, formal accusation, or community action against the household. This is among its most anomalous features as a folk record, and it is the feature that has generated the most sustained scholarly discussion about what the account actually is, whether it preserves the memory of events understood through the interpretive lens of the Sel'awa tradition, whether it is a ritual text encoded as community testimony, or whether it is, at its deepest level, a document of collective psychology that uses the form of an event account to describe something about the interior life of small communities in conditions of persistent and unresolvable knowledge. The account's conclusion is not a narrative ending. It is a cessation. The final sections of the fragments record that the community the account has been describing no longer existed at the time the account was reaching its final form. The village was gone. The people had dispersed. The account does not say why. It does not describe a plague or a flood or a raid or a famine. It simply notes, in the same flat register it has maintained throughout, that the settlement was no longer there. The people had gone elsewhere, to where the account does not say what they carried with them: the knowledge, the years of accommodation, the memory of standing at the water's edge and exchanging morning words with someone whose feet still carried the dust of the burial ground. The account does not say. What it says is that they were gone, and that the ground remained, and that the burial mounds on the plateau edge remained, and that the account itself, having been committed to transmission before the dispersal occurred, would also remain. The account keepers did this deliberately. They knew the community was ending, and, before it ended, they ensured that what the community knew would outlast it. They wrapped the papyrus carefully. They placed it where it could be found. They were right about its durability. The question that the scholarly literature on this account returns to most consistently is not what the women were. The folk tradition of the Sel'awa provides a framework for understanding what the community believed them to be, and that framework is itself a legitimate object of historical inquiry, telling us something real about how communities in this period organized their understanding of the boundary between the living and the domain of the dead, about what forms of transgression against that boundary were considered possible, and about what categories of being a community might need to name in order to manage its encounter with behaviors or events that fell outside ordinary comprehension. But the question the account makes most urgent is what the community was, what kind of knowing the account documents, and what it tells us about the conditions under which a community can sustain collective awareness of something deeply wrong in its midst, without that awareness ever becoming action, without it ever crossing the threshold from private knowledge to public speech. The account answers this question not by explaining it, but by demonstrating it, by building its record detail by detail, observation by observation, morning by morning, mound by mound, until the reader is inside the community's awareness, holding what the community held, and understanding from the inside, how it was possible to hold it for as long as the account records that they did. The Sel'awa tradition gave them a category. The category gave the thing a shape. The shape made coexistence possible. And the account gave the coexistence a record, so that what was known would not end with the people who had known it. This is what was preserved. This is what remained. A village with no name, a burial ground on a plateau edge, two women who walked to it at night and returned before dawn, a husband who stood among the opened graves for a long time and then came home, and a community that saw all of it, knew all of it, said nothing, and made sure the knowing survived them. The account does not ask the reader to judge the silence. It does not ask the reader to determine what the women were, or whether the tradition that named them was adequate to the thing it was naming, or whether the community's years of accommodation represented wisdom or failure, or simply the particular form of endurance available to people who have no other options. It asks only what the account keepers asked of every person to whom they passed the tradition, that the thing be held in full, without looking away, without reduction, for as long as the account requires. This is what they preserved and what they carried forward across generations of careful oral transmission and deliberate inscription into a medium they judged capable of outlasting them. This is what remains when everything else, the settlement, the people, the plateau path, the women, the man who sat in the evenings facing northeast, has gone, the account, the silence inside it, and the burial ground, wherever it stands, with its mound still on the plateau edge, and its soil, and whatever the soil still holds. The papyrus fragments themselves were examined most carefully during the period of increased scholarly attention to Demotic texts in the mid-20th century. Researchers noted several features of the physical document that added layers of complexity to its interpretation. The ink used across different sections of the text showed compositional differences consistent with multiple scribal hands working across a span of time. Not a single transcription event, but an accumulative recording in which each hand appears to have picked up from where the previous one concluded, across what may have been several generations of transmission before the account reached its recovered form. This physical evidence of multi-generational inscription aligns precisely with the oral tradition framing that the content itself implies. The account was not written down once, from memory, by a single witness. It was carried forward, preserved, amended at its margins by people who were carriers of the tradition rather than observers of the events, and eventually committed to the form in which it was found by people who were themselves removed from the events by enough time that the village had already been gone for as long as anyone living could remember. What they preserved was not memory. It was the structure of a memory, the shape of what had happened, the sequence of what had been known, and the fact of the silence that had surrounded all of it. From the first disturbed mound to the last morning at the water's edge, the burial ground on the plateau edge has not been conclusively identified. Unaffiliated rural necropolises from the relevant period are numerous and difficult to attribute to specific settlement communities without corroborating administrative records, and this village generated none. But researchers working in the relevant geographic range have noted, in excavated plateau burial sites, anomalies that correspond precisely to the features the fragments describe. Post-interment soil disturbance followed by deliberate resurfacing, modified burial preparation consistent with attempts to reinforce and seal the interment materials, and patterns of disturbance that appear concentrated in a specific and relatively brief period before ceasing, as though the circumstances that produced them had ended, not gradually, but completely, as a settlement ends when its people leave. The soil holds what happened. The mounds still stand on the plateau edge, wherever they are. Whatever was opened there has been closed again for a very long time. The account is what remains of the knowledge of what was opened, and what returned to close it, and what the village knew about both and chose to keep. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, to the accounts that survived not because they were preserved by the powerful, but because ordinary communities decided they were too important to lose, consider subscribing. There are many more records like this one, many more silences that have not yet been fully listened to.